dangerous stage of my life. Desperately needed to find
I searched for
out.
anything that might help.
Hi, I'm Julian Archer. Welcome to Faith versus Finance. I'd like to share some thoughts with you about the impact of affluence on spirituality, the effect of money on our relationship with Jesus Christ. And I'd like to start by sharing my testimony because in the book of Revelation, chapter 12, verse 11, it says that we overcome Satan by the blood of the Lamb and the word of our testimony. My testimony is my family's testimony. It starts many years ago. In fact, it starts when my dad was just a child. When he was a kid, he had to go to church 8 and sometimes 11 times every week. And he hated it. He completely hated church. Another one of his jobs was to make the beer for the family. And he actually had to make the beer for the extended family, and being a young beer maker, a young brewer, he drank more than he should have. So you can imagine, by the time he was in his early teens, he was pretty messed up in some ways. But he went along to church every week, and when he was in church, he tried to work out a way to stop going to church every week, and he would look around at the building and work out how he could maybe destroy the whole building. He was what we might call today a dynamite church planter, because he actually went to his uncle's farm when he was about 14 years of age and got some gelignite and some fuses and took them home. And he went to school the next day, and when he was at school, he said to his friend, "You know what? Tonight, I'm going to blow up my church." Well, his friend normally would just laugh at that and go, "Yeah, right, whatever." But his friend knew that my father used to get the cuts, that's the cane, every day between grades 8 and grade 10. And so he knew he was troubled. And so my father's friend actually went to the police and told them what was going to go on that night. And the police came to the school and took my father away and said, "What's the problem, son?" Well, my father explained the issue about going to church so many times a week and how much he hated it. And he explained that he just couldn't handle it anymore and he just wanted to drop that church, and he had worked out in the church exactly where to put the dynamite so that that night he could bring the whole thing down. Well, the police sort of, I guess, had some pity on him, and they actually took him home and took his parents away. Well, they didn't take them away to jail or anything, but they took them aside, and after they had collected the gelignite, they said, "Do you realise that your son was going to use this tonight to blow up your church? I think you need to back off on the religion a bit." Well, they did ease off somewhat, but he still decided to leave home soon thereafter, went to live with his brother. And when he was out there in the world, he had absolutely no interest in God or religion of any sort. He bought a welder, and a friend of his asked him whether he could weld up a thing called a bench press. Now, a bench press is a machine that you lie on flat and you push the weights away from your chest. And so Dad got some steel and he got his welder and he welded up a bench press and he sold it to his friend, and he actually made a small profit. And he thought, "Hey, that's a cool way of making money." So he bought some more steel and made another bench and sold it to another person, and another and another. And he ended up starting a small business called Archer Bodybuilding Equipment. And once he had started supplying gyms and fitness centres and different things with this equipment, and he had his own foundry for pouring the weights as well, he thought, well, we've got all this cheap equipment because we make it ourselves, why don't we start our own gym? And by this stage he was married to my mum. They got married at 19 and they opened up a gym. And before you know it, that first gym, Archer's Gym, had 1,000 members. And they thought, well, hey, why don't we open another one? So they opened another one and another 1,000 members. And they also had started at that stage a refrigeration business because my dad had some experience in refrigeration. And while you're at it, when you've got 4 businesses, why not have 5? And so they started a health food store to sell healthy foods to those people who were coming along to the gyms. And so they had, by the age of 25, they were actually running 5 businesses. 18 hours a day they were working. They had 2 children, myself and my older sister. And life was chaos. It was success. It was the success that everybody dreamt of. They had started from scratch 5 businesses, had built them up to a good size. They had good income from those businesses. but their marriage was absolutely shot. And they had to make a choice between business and marriage. And I thank God that they chose marriage. So their decision was to sell the businesses. The only one they kept was the health food store. And they decided to move out to the bush and become what you could probably call hippies. That was the 1970s, 1974 we moved out. And we bought a little block of land, 33 acres of land, in between a couple of thousand acres of cattle property on one side and a couple of thousand on the other side. So we just had this tiny hideaway right out in the bush. And because we were hippies and we were trying to grow all of our own food, and Dad was growing a big long beard, and even though I was a boy I had long hair down my back, and we didn't actually wear a whole lot of clothes because there were no neighbours around to see us, and we didn't get visitors. We were right up the end of a track up in the mountains. And I can still remember we would go for our daily bath, and of course we had no running water and we had no electricity, so there was no such thing as a shower or anything like that. And so we would actually walk down to the dam on the property where the cattle would drink, and we'd go down there and we would have our bath. Well, we would walk down with no clothes on, and we'd wash ourselves, and we'd walk back with no clothes on. You didn't have towels or anything because you'd be dry by the time you got back anyway, so that's all good. And I can still remember one day, I was about 5 years old, and we were walking down to the dam, and it's Dad and Mum and my sister and myself in a line, and we're just walking along, beautiful day. And the farmer on his horse rode up on the other side of the fence that we were walking beside, and I can still remember as a young child standing there looking up at the farmer and talking to him, Mum and Dad talking to him about the weather and his cattle and business and that sort of thing. And we're all totally naked, and I can remember as a little child thinking, there's something wrong with this. I didn't really know what it was, but I just thought there's something wrong with this. And so that's how I grew up, a very carefree sort of a life. Well, it actually got to a point, and I guess the word got around because one of the cattle properties on one side went up for sale, and it was advertised in the newspaper as cattle property for sale overlooking nudist colony. Well, that was us. It wasn't much of a nudist colony, there was only 4 of us. Living in our little 8-foot by 14-foot shed with no running water. It was just us out there in the bush. Well, during this time, we still had the health food store in a town called Ipswich, near Brisbane. And Mum or Dad would go into that health food store Monday to Friday to run it and keep everything rolling well. Well, there was a guy who used to come into that health food store every day. His name was Harry Walker. And Harry would come in and buy a loaf of bread. Just one loaf of bread, nothing else, but we're really not sure what he used to do with it because there was only Harry and his wife Dot at home, and so they couldn't really eat it all themselves. Now at that stage, Harry was about 60 years old. He worked as an engineer in the railways, and he was just coming in and getting to know us. And he would ask Mum, how are the kids? And he'd ask Dads, hey, how's that house going that you're building, Ray? Looking back on it, we realised what he was doing was friendship evangelism. One day Harry came in to the shop and he knew that we were building a house at the time. My father was building a house out of sandstone and logs. And so Harry came in and he said, Ray, there's a program coming to town and it's about Egypt, you know, how they built the pyramids. I wonder if you'd like to come along because I know you're building a house out of stone. And Dad was like, yeah, that sounds like a pretty good idea. And so we all piled into the old Land Rover utility that we had, the old pickup, and we went into the town of Ipswich and listened to a program about Egypt. And that was really quite interesting. And so we went back on another night and listened to another one on something else and another and another and another. And you know what, we went through the whole program, never learned anything about how to build out of stone, that the Egyptians, you know, with their pyramids and everything knew. But we met some wonderful people. And then we went back to the bush. We just went back to live our life as we were, trying to grow all of our own food. And Mum and Dad were still in the shop. And one day later, maybe some months later, Harry came back in and he said, you know what, there's a program coming to town. It's a vegetarian cooking program. And I'm just wondering whether you'd like to come along and learn how to eat vegetarian food. And Dad was like, no way. I mean, why would you? Dad had pioneered the bodybuilding industry in Queensland in those days. It was all about, if you eat this many pounds of meat, then you'll put on this many pounds of muscle. And so he was like, no, none of this lettuce and all the rest of it. And so he said, no, I'm not going along. However, Mum, who knew that we had a lot of customers coming into the shop who were vegetarians, she said to Dad, hey, look, why don't we go along? Because we'll be able to sell more ingredients and things to our vegetarian customers. So Dad, being an astute businessman, thought, yeah, okay, let's head along. So we went along to the vegetarian cooking program, and I still remember it was, you know, my sister and myself and Mum and Dad, the whole family. Whenever we went to town at night time, the whole family went. And would you believe it? But the same people who were in the Egypt program were attending the vegetarian cooking program. Of course, we didn't know that that was actually a group of Christians who were running both of the programs and trying to tell people about Jesus, but we just thought it was great to go along and meet those same people again and have a great time with them. So we went to the cooking programs, and then we went back to the bush. One day Harry came into the shop and he said, Ray, would you like to come to church? Well, you can imagine, you know, Dad had been to church enough in his childhood, more than most people would go to church in their entire lifetime. And he was like, no, I'm not interested. But he didn't say that. His way of getting out of it was to ask Harry a question. And he knew what Harry's answer would be, or he thought he did. And he knew that that was going to be his excuse. And so he said, Harry, what day do you go to church? And Harry said, Saturday mornings. Oh, Dad was sure he was going to say Sunday, because Sunday was the day we never went into town. But it was Saturday mornings. And the thing was that on Saturday mornings, that's when we used to drive into town and buy any groceries that we needed from the supermarket and then drive back out to the bush. So Dad said, okay, we'll come along this Saturday morning and we'll come to church. So we drove into town, we did our grocery shopping, we hopped into the ute, drove back around to the church. And when we got to the church, we found we had a problem because the ute didn't lock. It was an old Land Rover. The locks didn't work on the doors. We couldn't leave all of our valuable groceries in the back, and we couldn't put them in the front because they still wouldn't be safe. And so what could we do? Well, we packed them all into beer boxes because they were the only boxes we had, with a big 4X beer brand on the side of them. And we took a box each and we walked into church. And so again, it was Dad, Mum, my sister, myself, and into church we walked, carrying our freshly purchased groceries. Well, we got in there, we didn't know what to do with all these groceries. Nobody else had groceries. We didn't really know why, but because Saturday mornings when everybody went shopping. And so we got our boxes of groceries and we slipped them in underneath the seats that we were going to sit on, and then we sat down on top of them to make sure that our groceries for the week were safe. And we sat there and listened, and of course Dad was still smoking a bit at the time, drinking too much alcohol. We looked very different. Our clothes that we did wear when we wore them were quite alternate. Bare feet on the kids, you know, Dad with the long beard, me with hair down my back. We were different. And I just want to give you all those details simply because the people in that church never said anything to us about how we looked, smelt, acted, dressed, whatever it was. They just loved us. They loved us into Jesus Christ. And I thank God for them. I don't know what they said in their board meetings. They probably asked a few questions about, whoa, who's that family? What are they, you know, do we need to talk to them about some of those things? But you know, the Holy Spirit works in an interesting way. He touched our hearts, and as we looked around and saw that other people weren't doing or looking or whatever like we were, we asked our friend Harry, and Harry lovingly explained to us why people were or weren't doing certain things. Well, in those days we had a fruit tree nursery. By this time we were coming into the 1980s, and that nursery actually had a whole lot of fruit and nut trees. In fact, it had 214 different varieties of fruit and nut trees. And we sold them all through different parts of Queensland and sometimes interstate as well. But Mum and Dad had learned about Jesus, and they wanted to tell everybody about Jesus. And so they thought, well, how do you do that? Well, clearly the way you tell people about Jesus is you get on a plane, you fly over to Egypt, you take some photos of the pyramids, you come back, you rent a hall, you pay for an advertisement in the newspaper, you buy a projector and a screen, and every Sunday night you invite people to come along and you tell them about Egypt. And then you tell them about Jesus. And so that's what we did. And the profits from our small fruit and nut tree nursery we used to share Jesus with people in the towns about. And we went from one town to the next. And in fact, we got to a point where we had done mission programs in just about every little town around us. And Mum and Dad decided that they wanted to step out in faith and go full time into evangelism. So to do that, they knew they would have to sell the nursery. They had already sold the health food store, and the nursery was the only business they had. But before selling the nursery, they wanted to know, because they knew that once they sold the nursery, they wouldn't have income that would last forever. And so they needed income in the future. And so they thought, well, which one of these 214 varieties of fruit and nut trees might have a future in Australia? And they didn't really know. I mean, it's like crystal ball trying to know what the future was. But they wanted to work out which one of those was the variety that had a future in Australia. So they got their catalogue in their hand, they got a pen, and they got down on their knees and they said, Lord, please show us which one of these has a future in Australia that we can use to support evangelism when our current money runs out. And they went through the list. Is it apples? No. Bananas? No. Cherimoyas? No. Durians? No, it wouldn't be durians. And they just went down through that list. And they got to a point where they got it down to one plant. And that variety was the olive tree. Now, the olive trees in Australia at the time, it wasn't a very big industry at all. There were about 100,000 olive trees growing around the country, which isn't very many. They were mainly growing in the backyards of Greeks and Italians. But they felt convicted that God had shown them that the olive tree had a future in Australia. So they kept their olive trees, they sold all the other 213 varieties, they sold that nursery, and they took their olive trees on the road. And they went and did evangelism in different towns. And when they would come into a town, and they would plant the olive trees in the ground in the backyard of where they were living, and when they moved on, they would dig them up and take them with them. Finally, they thought these olive trees are getting a pretty hard life, so they bought a little farm and planted the trees in the ground permanently so they weren't being dragged all around the country. And they went off to do evangelism down in Sydney. While they were down there, they decided that they needed some more income. And so they actually started selling baby olive trees from their backyard in Sydney. It was a very, very, very small business. And I remember one day Dad coming to me and saying, Julian, we want to start this olive tree business. What should we call it? And I said, oh, I don't know, let's call it Olives Australia. It sounds like a great big name for a very, very small business. And by that time I had graduated from college and had got married to Melinda. And we were trying to work out, well, where do we live now that we're married? Melinda had to finish some studies and all the rest. And I said, how about I go back up to Queensland and I'll start this olive tree nursery from Queensland, the one that you've been doing down in Sydney. And they said, yeah, but we think we should come with you and we'll do evangelism from there because this business is going to be too big for you to manage on your own. And I was like, what? Too big? You've been running it out of your backyard. They said, no, we'll come up as well. You know, within 4 years, that nursery, Olives Australia, was the largest olive tree nursery in the world. God just blessed it and it grew and grew and grew at a very rapid rate. Well, the thing that got me out of bed in those years, managing that business, was making profit graphs go up just as fast as I possibly could. It gave me my energy. It was why I got out of bed. I started to feel the excitement of business, the excitement that my entrepreneurial parents had, I guess, felt for years prior to becoming Christians. And I got involved in those businesses and we grew them and they grew fast. In fact, the olive tree nursery, we sold those olive trees, more than 1 million trees a year into the Australian market. And the Australian olive industry took off very quickly. Well, by the 2000s, we were selling another product called olive leaf extract. We had 5 olive businesses across the time that we were in the olive industry. And it became Australia's #1 selling health product. God blessed again, and that medicine just shot up in sales. And we used the profits of those businesses to support evangelism and other things around the world. We wanted to do everything we could for God, and we saw God's hand in those businesses. By 2007, we decided that this olive leaf business that was selling products in 25 countries around the world and had 500,000 olive trees growing on a single farm, we decided that we wanted to move out of that business. And so we actually sold that business right on the eve of the GFC, the global financial crisis. Now, the question that I have for you is, what impact did these years of seeing God so clearly at work in our businesses, seeing miracles as He grew those businesses and opened up new markets around the world, what impact did that have on my heart and my relationship with God. I mean, I had grown up in businesses. That's just how it was. I was in an entrepreneurial family. My parents were serial entrepreneurs. That last one we sold was our 12th business. And for the last half dozen of them, we had seen God leading and leading and leading. So how did seeing God's leading in those businesses and being involved in making those profit graphs go up, how did that affect my relationship with Him? Well, I guess the natural consequence you would think would be that it strengthened my relationship, because I could just see God leading here, there and everywhere else. And we were supporting work in so many different countries around the world, evangelistic work and mission work and humanitarian work. I was taking sermons, I was teaching lessons, I was very heavily involved in my church. But you know what? The opposite actually occurred. Because money has claws. Some people say money is like fire and that it's just a neutral thing. You know, like fire can be used to warm yourself, or fire can be used to burn something down. But I want to tell you that money has claws. It's not neutral. What happened to me? Well, number one, I became proud. I became proud because the business that I was involved in, or the number of businesses that I was involved in, were growing faster than any of the other businesses of my friends. And I thought, Julian, you're a pretty good businessman. You're a pretty good salesman. You get to fly all over the world and visit partners and different things in different parts of the world. And I became proud. The second thing that happened to me is that I became a Pharisee. Let me explain that to you. You know, in my Bible, it tells me that, God tells me, Julian, if you obey me, I will bless you. And so as I looked around at the blessings that were just pouring into our lives, I thought, man, we must be being really obedient. And this is where the Pharisee kicked in, because I went, in fact, we must be being more obedient than all of our friends, because we're being blessed more than our friends. Well, you can see the Pharisee coming through there loud and clear. The third thing that happened to me is that I became very self-reliant. God had blessed me so much that I didn't need Him anymore. Now, of course, that's not true. I did need Him. I needed Him for every breath. But subconsciously, I had everything I needed, and I didn't need God anymore. And remember, I was still going to church. I was still actively involved. I was still a leader in my church. But this crazy thing was going on in my mind and in my heart. I was becoming very self-reliant and less reliant on God. A few years ago, I was trekking in the Himalayas with my two boys. We were right up around, must have been around 4,500 meters, and I came across a small poster. It had been a long day. I had been trekking with my two boys. We had just done 3,000 steps up the side of a valley. And as I sat down, I looked up at the wall of this little building that we were at, and there was a little tiny poster up on the wall. And this is what it said. It was a quote by Mahatma Gandhi, and it said, "The fact is, the moment financial stability is assured, spiritual bankruptcy is also assured." Ouch. You know, for the 15 or 20 years prior to reading that poster, that's exactly what I'd been doing. I had been working hard to become financially secure. But in my heart, that place that nobody else sees, I had to admit that over that time I was also becoming more and more spiritually bankrupt. You know, Jesus said something very, very similar. He said, "It's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter heaven." And deep, deep inside my heart, that place where nobody else sees, I knew that the more God blessed me, the less I needed Him. That was my mistake. That was my error. What I had begun to realize is that when God blesses you, when God blessed me, I was actually in the most spiritually dangerous stage of my life. I want to say that again. When we are blessed by God with talents, with treasures, material goods, whatever it is, we are actually in the most spiritually dangerous stage of our lives. I desperately needed to find out how to stop God's blessings from becoming curses. Is it possible to be financially secure without becoming spiritually bankrupt? 15 years seeking to answer that question, I just looked and looked and looked. I was trying to serve God and money at the same time. I was fighting the faith versus finance battle in my heart. But is it possible? Is it possible to be financially secure without becoming spiritually bankrupt? The answer is yes, but there are significant conditions attached. Yes, it is possible to be financially secure without becoming spiritually bankrupt, and I look forward to sharing how to do that in our next session. The next session is called The Cross-Eyed Christian, and we're going to look at some of the tools, some of the tricks, if you like, of how to maintain a relationship with Christ even when we are being blessed materially by Him. And it's not easy. I want to tell you, it's a battle. It's a significant battle to avoid walking away from Christ when He blesses us so much that we want to start worshipping the gifts instead of the giver. When we start to fill our hearts with those gifts instead of with Jesus Christ. So I look forward to the next session, The Cross-Eyed Christian. Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, Lord, I just want to thank You at this time for Your patience and Your grace. Lord, as I walked through that journey where I was walking away from You, even though it appeared that I was still with You at church and I was wearing that mask that made it look like everything was okay, I want to thank You for Your patience and Your grace, allowing me to go through that time safely in Your arms. Lord, I want to thank You too that You kept me looking back to Your word. And Father, as we go through the rest of these episodes, I just want to pray that You will guide us and touch us and draw us nearer to You. I pray this in Jesus' precious name. Amen.
Julian's book, Help, I've Been Blessed, is a powerful and challenging expose of the spiritual struggles faced by affluent Christians. The struggle is real. Jesus is knocking at our heart's door, but can we even reach the handle? Join Julian on an incredibly honest, soul-bearing journey into his life as a successful Christian businessman. Remember, when a person prospers, either God gains a partner or the person loses their soul. You will be challenged and inspired by this book. Order your copy today at faithversusfinance.org.